Now to give us a keynote speech, we are honored to invite Dr. Paul Mockapetris, Chief Scientist at ThreatSTOP. Please welcome Dr. Mockapetris.
Let me introduce Paul, if I may. I've known Paul seemingly forever as a student at the University of California, Irvine, and as certainly a colleague and a person who's had tremendous impact on the evolution of the internet. Also just a wonderful person, personally. I could rattle on Paul's honors. They include National Academy of Engineers, IEEE Fellow, ACM Fellow, ... Why don't I just leave that to Paul to talk to us? Paul?
Sure. Thank you, Dave, for that kind introduction. More than 50 years ago, when I was in high school, a bunch of people tried to schedule an intervention and get me to discard the false god of technocracy and to worry about civilization and the greater issues. So it's kind of fun to come back to this. But I'm afraid that what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about what it's like out up there on the coalface and what I think we need to do. Whoops. Next. How do I go to the next slide? Okay, I'm known mostly for the DNS, and people keep asking me about, when I was at ISI and I was doing this work, who was talking to me and where did I get the ideas? And most of the good ideas in the DNS came from places that I failed before I did the DNS. So, for example, at the MIT Architecture Machine Group, now the Media Lab, I did a distributed file system, but I had fixed size names and I had a 2-level hierarchy. And everybody complained about it. So I said, I will never do a fixed hierarchy ever again. And I will also tend to let you have big names. And the other thing was that seeing as this was multiple machines, at the time the disk drive was more expensive than the CPUs. So we were sharing disk drives. We had to have a consistency mechanisms, and I learned that getting the right consistency mechanism is a very important thing. At the Draper Lab, I worked with a bunch of spacecraft things. Nowadays, I guess they're reprogrammable, and you just load new code and so forth. But there, once you sent it off, it was going to do what it was going to do. And you would try and figure out how to put redundancy into it in ways that just could not fail. My favorite example of this was they were trying to figure out how to control the 3 actuators that could move the rocket engine around. And what happened if an actuator failed? And they had a bunch of very complicated computer code to do all of this and to vote, because you had to have multiple computers and so forth and so on. And eventually they settled on the mechanism that said, we'll just have a computer for each of the actuators and let them arm wrestle. And the mechanical thing will work it out, because any 2 of them can overcome the other one. And I met Dave at UC Irvine and learned a bunch of things there. Actually, I think 50 years ago when we did a seminar, 50 years ago we were doing cloud computing but didn't know it. If we had only had good marketing people, the world might have been our oyster. But one of the things, the key aspect there was it was about naming. So things I learned there were that complicated names, longer names aren't necessarily better. You should ask for help when you need it, which doesn't have anything to do with civilization, but has a lot to do with success in life. We didn't really have a great application for this. And what's really important is another issue. So let's see if I can get to the next slide. I can't. Now you might say, what does that have to do with cyber civilization? I'm going to claim that we made a lot of mistakes, but that we haven't been really great about learning from them. And in particular, there's some mistakes that we're not sure that we can reverse. So I'm going to talk about three things: network security, what I do during the day, DNS, what the IETF was doing to the DNS last week, and Bert's frogs. What we do at ThreatSTOP is we generate lots of data that go into block lists for IP and things like that, instructions for firewalls, and similar instructions for DNS servers. These days, seeing as content distribution networks like Cloudflare, I would bet that for every person in this audience, Cloudflare hosts content that you would find offensive. Okay? It'll be different. No offense. But, you know, the pirate people, you know, they don't get along well with the publishers. You know, you have Hamas, you have all kinds of different organizations. So I'm sure that all of us find something wrong in that network. And you can't even try to filter it by IP address. Domain names are perhaps poor, but they're a lot closer. So that's what I do as a day job. And there's all of this filtering technology we've built up over the years. I've never understood why filtering DNS is bad, whereas filtering email is good. But I think we're going to get over that. So these days, you know, that's about the left-hand side here is about. That one's working, this one's not. Okay. So the left-hand side is the traditional defense against bad guys. The right-hand side has to do with defense against your government, your friends, I guess. So I'm going to talk about that. You know, the U.S. has at least 20 different sanction types. You know, most recently, or at least most prominently about the Ukraine. Recently, Sony has been suing the pirate content distributors in Germany to say, take their domain names away. And so far the German courts have gone along with that. So that your government is telling you about what you should delete here. And yeah, some of it is censorship. Some of it is just good hygiene. But public policy is now entering into this field. And when I think about the internet and the 50 years of history and so forth, I think, you know, we used to say the internet changes everything. I think the right model is sort of Newton's second law, which is for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So the internet hits society and society moves it back. The internet hits business and business moves it back. In general, the big changes in the internet have been profoundly influenced by who the population is, from network researchers to the educational people, to commercial people, to society in general. And so, you know, the reaction is always important. So we have today's sort of dynamic geography. You know, Russia went into the Ukraine. And one of the things they did as soon as they went into the Ukraine is that as they invaded, they would take the local ISP and they would say, no, we're going to backhaul that through Russia. So they reconnected through the Soviet Union. Now we happen to have a customer who wants to ship packages around the world. But they came to us and they said, you know, how do we know whether we can ship packages to this particular company in the Ukraine? So, and the other thing about this is that, so, you know, an example here is supposing you get a call from a nuclear power plant that says, help, we need a pump or else we're going to flood Europe with radiation. Okay, pretty dire thing. So we have, on the left, we have Zaporizhzhia, which is the big place. And for a while it was okay to ship there, but now the Russians own it, and you can't. We have Chernobyl on the right, which for a while was okay, and then for a while wasn't, and is okay again today. You know, so how do you deal with these kinds of questions? And this dynamic geography, it's a little bit like BGP hijacking. The end user has no way to detect that there might be a man in the middle all of a sudden. And despite what you may think, a lot of the internet security that we get has to do with connectivity as opposed to digital certificates and so forth. The network has to detect it. Man-in-the-middle attacks are sort of pretty bad. The reason for that is that supposing we have Z here, the Russian infrastructure that's between the server you want to talk to and where you are, obviously they can just decide not to pass the traffic through. So denial of service, piece of cake, not a problem. They also get to take a look at all of the traffic and try and interfere with it. So who's standing guard there? What's the technology that's guarding you? Once upon a time, they told you that DNSSEC would be there to guard you, and indeed, some top-level domains and educational institutions and so forth are there. But there's two problems with that. One of which is if you use an obscure service like, say, Outlook, it's not DNSSEC signed. Okay. There's lots of other examples like that. And by the way, I'm being sarcastic about Outlook. That's Microsoft's mass-produced service. The other thing about it is if you take a look at your client, have you ever said, as you're connecting to your bank, by God, I want DNSSEC certification? There's no way for you to do that. The big failure of DNSSEC, in my opinion, is that there's no way for the client to demand it. So what's left? What's left is the digital certificates that you have. All right. First of all, there's 200 digital certificate authorities or so? And if you have 200 organizations, the odds that they're all good guys is pretty slim. That either some of them have been hacked or some of them just are owned by bad guys. So the protection there that you have is pretty thin after you've removed the routing. All right, well, that's pretty easy though. We can keep track of these different pieces of data so that we can tell who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. Well, no, there's literally thousands of these. It varies depending upon whether or not, the US has one set. The Five Eyes people kind of follow that. The EU has a different set. There's lots of other countries like Iran, Syria, North Korea, etc., that have their own set of restrictions. Okay, but supposing you just say, well, okay, Russia's the problem. Well, it's Russian-controlled entities. So that, for example, the Russians have a holding company in Cyprus, and they have a bank in Africa and so forth. So geography itself doesn't solve your problem. What does this mean for businesses? Well, it creates risk for businesses because, you'd like to have your nice big website that's selling goods all the time and just drop shipping the packages and running at high speed. But if you run across these sanctions, you're subject to fines. All of a sudden, all of the banking system, they say, well, no, we won't deal with you. Or you could go to jail. It's a problem for businesses who kind of want to view the world as their marketplace. You might say, well, nobody's going to come after me. Well, I'm pretty sure that the CFO of Huawei didn't think that she was going to get arrested, but she did. And it's not just China and Huawei. The moral equivalent royalty in the UK, Graham Bonham Carter, if you recognize that name, it's prestigious UK, ran into the same trouble. There's no one that's immune to these kind of things. My favorite example is, you might say, well, I'll just say I didn't know. Well, these people said they didn't know. It's a Danish company who had a supplier in a subcontract, totally different country and so forth. And the government said, yeah, we believe you. You didn't know. That's okay, so we'll let you off with only a fine of $4 million, okay, for shipping these parts to where we didn't like. So it's a big problem for businesses. So what would you like to have happen? You don't want the legacy model where every time you get a purchase order or whatever, some analyst has to go and examine it and say yes or no. What you would like is something that's an automated system that just cuts off requests, filters requests, just like you're trying to filter out bad guys. And so that's the business that ThreatSTOP is in. I'm going to tell you the secret sauce about how we do it a little bit. For two reasons, one of which I find it kind of interesting, and secondly, if you want to compete with us, then you'll know how, but you'll also realize it's not a great business to be in, so you won't. So what are the steps? So supposing your government comes along and says, block Huawei. All right, well, the U.S. Department of the Treasury has this thing called OFAC, and they publish this thing, and they'll tell you, who's naughty and who's not. Well, gee, you could find out that Huawei has an office in Santiago, Chile. Okay. There's a service called 5by that will tell you who the entities are for the bad guys list. And then there's these printed documents that get issued by courts and other parts of the government where you can go and read them and find out who's naughty and who's nice. So sifting through all of that, there's a different EU sanctions map too. So if you have an office in the EU, things may be slightly different than your office in San Francisco, say. So you have to try and put all of that stuff together. Some of it isn't going to be stuff that you can read easily. And then you take a look at network maps, you take a look at AS maps. And so, Huawei's in a lot of places, as you can see from all the different flags. So this is not easy. And then there's the BGP announcements and the fact that the network routing may change and maybe you don't want to route through any part of Russia. So it's not easy. So basically the service that we provide is that we collect all of that information, we try and make sense of it, have a database, and then you come along and you say, okay, here's the rules that I would like to follow. And we give automated updates to your firewalls, routers, and servers. And so packages, absolutely positively, you can send them via FedEx and they will get delivered to the Ukraine, but only the right parts. But this is an issue that's getting to be more and more, where the government is telling you about how to balkanize the internet. I'm sorry. Now, I'm going to have to tell you that I think this whole business about we have this internet that's all collected and everybody is happy and we're all connected and everybody wants to connect. That's never been the case. The internet has always been balkanized and always will be. The right way to think about this is that you have a level of cooperation that you have between parties that want to cooperate, and bottom up, we build up the connectivity that we have. I can give you a couple of examples of that. Before we had the internet, back when we had the ARPANET, there was this question about whether Net 10 and Net 26, the MILNET and the ARPANET, could connect, and if so, what traffic could pass over. The first top-level, country code top-level domain was UK, right? Why was it UK? Well, no, according to the international standards, it was supposed to be GB. Why was it UK? It was because the people in Great Britain wanted to make sure that they were governing Ireland as well. So they wanted UK, which includes Northern Ireland. So, the political boundaries have always been part of the internet. And I think that really thinking about it as being all one big thing, and oh my God, let's not let it get sliced up. No, no, no. It's always been broken up into pieces, and the question is, how do we fit the mosaic together? All right, next subject. We have DNS, DNS privacy. For those of you that don't follow DNS stuff, basically what's happening is a lot of the big guys on the internet had said, oh my God, we need to reach out and protect you. Your DNS traffic is being carried by an ISP, and your ISP can look at the DNS queries and figure out where you want to go. And oh my God, they will use that to violate your privacy or create marketing information and so forth. And yeah, they will. I mean, I once upon a time was working on technology that, among other things, could do that. It turns out most people in the US, most ISPs don't really bother with it. But you know, places like, for example, Saudi, they're very fond of this technology. Well, what's encrypting this thing and the way they've done it, which is equally important, this thing called DO. Basically what they do is they map all of your DNS traffic into an HTTPS connection. And furthermore, they have this policy for where they send that connection, which is the sort of more annoying part of it. The benefits of this are the network operator can't see your DNS traffic. The drawbacks are the network operator can't see your DNS traffic. And you say, well, wait a second, how can we both benefit? It does keep it private from, like, say, my home from the cable company Comcast, which doesn't look at it anyway. But what it also prevents is services such like DNS filtering and so forth from keeping you from going to the bad guys. So the question is whether or not the people that own the network can get to look at your traffic and get to decide where you can go or not. You know, end-to-end encryption means that all of the traditional things like firewalls and so forth, you either have to legally or some other way force people to hand them a set of keys, but they can't help you. All right. The side effect of the way they're doing this is that they would like you to connect up to places like Cloudflare or so forth, which will provide free 111 DNS service. Now, if you recall what I said about Cloudflare was that you know, they host lots of bad stuff. Lots of good stuff too, no offense. I mean, but they're in the business of getting paid per click. They're hosting. So is there ever going to be a case where they're going to say, oh no, you don't want this content, it has malware in it? Nope, they just deliver it. They get paid to deliver it. So, you know, these things that tend to steer you to people that have no filters on them are, in my opinion, not a really good thing. Now, there are going to be some people like, you know, Quad9 and so forth that will do more of that. But, you know, go back to this, like, why does, I said Comcast, my ISP, they don't bother to do this. Why is it? They actually happen to have bought the technology I did at Nominum, so they have the tool. Why don't they do that? Well, the answer is it's not as great as all the other mechanisms to violate your privacy. Let me give you an example. Paul buys a car. Once upon a time, I said, I need to buy a car. All right. So my ISP knows that I was looking at BMW.com and Ford and Toyota. And they know, because I went to Toyota.com. They know. All right. So at any rate, I just finally decided to buy that particular car there. And I went to the dealer, and it was an unpopular model at the time. So the dealer had like 24 of them. And basically the last choice was, what color did I like? I decided I liked the silver one. So I bought the silver one. Went out to have dinner. When I got home, I had an email in my inbox offering me, among other things, touch-up paint in silver for the exact model of car I had just bought. Now, my ISP couldn't figure that out from the fact that I had gone to several car dealers. So the point here is that there's a lot of spying on you that has nothing to do with the DNS, and the DNS is not really a good way to spy on those people. So if you're worried about security, if you're thinking this is about security, think again. Okay, my last subject for today, Bert's frogs. Bert Hubert is a polymath that I happen to have met and has done a bunch of fascinating things. One of which was this essay, which had me depressed for days, but I'm going to say maybe we can learn from it, and it's a mistake that we can avoid making over and over again. Why is it about frogs? Well, there's a popular story about how if you put a frog in a pot of water and put that on a stove and bring the temperature up, the frog won't realize that what's going on and will get cooked. It's not true. Okay, although it's used over and over again as a story, a metaphor. But I think what Bert's argument was in his essay, which I'm going to steal from, is that it appears that people aren't smart enough to do this. That we've been cooked by basically the sort of whole internet and computer world. He actually, I'm only going to talk mostly about the internet issues, but for example, he talks about how, well, gee, you know, down at the chip level, it's broken. But let's talk about some of Bert's examples. I highly recommend that you go and pull this off the web, by the way, and just read it once, get depressed. Have a nice day. There's CPUs. I said CPUs were an issue. In 1999, the EU and other people had this huge kerfuffle about, they said, no, Intel is going to make CPUs that have IDs that are readable from inside. And people said, oh God, that's a terrible thing. They eventually got something that was like that. There's another thing, which is people say, you know, back in the 2000s, early on when I was doing some of this DNS stuff, and we were having servers, and we were saying, well, gee, should we be able to poll the server and see if it's up, or see if it, has the right version number, and tell the customer. The customer said, no, don't you dare touch to it. Once we've bought it, we'll run it, and you don't talk to it ever. Well, by 2015, they had replaced something, the CPU ID, with another field that's a moral equivalent, but also works in virtual machines. And so that business about how that would violate our privacy, the temperature went up and we didn't notice. As Bert, in 2022, he says, well, Google and other people log almost every click that you make, and some of the clicks you don't make. In other words, when you're just moving your mouse around. And they download new stuff into your machine whenever they want, for whatever purpose. So, I personally liked it when I controlled the software in my machine, and I liked it when I had some idea about being anonymous. But that's all gone. The progression of the problem was that whatever it was unacceptable or illegal. Then it was, well, ask for permission. Then you don't really have to ask for permission. Well, but you can turn it off. You can opt out. This is when opt-in became the default. And then it was, well, you can take a look at what's going on, even if you don't like it. And now with things like Go, you have these systems where you can't turn it off, you can't see what's happening. Who's in charge? It's not you. And then there's even, seeing as it's all encrypted and hidden, they can even lie about whether or not it's happening over and over again. So I think that when we think about cyber civilization and particularly regulation, you know, if this was all a mistake in a way, should we have reacted earlier or something? You know, there's always the argument that it was wonderful in the early days that we had a lack of regulation and free blah, blah, blah. That was wonderful. Spurred innovation. Yeah, but it got the momentum going of the people that wanted to invade their privacy. You know, we would, if we had known then what we know now, we might try to have changed things or stopped that. My favorite example of this is when I had gone to work for ARPA, which is a government agency that sponsors research for the military. But, you know, they invented the ARPANET and a bunch of things that have nothing to do, perhaps, with, you know, making holes in things, which they do some of. And the NSF was about to say, okay, you no longer will be given domain names, you'll have to buy them, and we're going to commercialize it. And I had a friend who was the head lawyer at the SEC at the time, and I went to him and I said, you know, NSF tells me that they will be able to control a vendor in the marketplace. I don't believe them, but, you know, you're a regulator and blah, blah, blah. He says, oh no. He says, there is no such thing as a level playing field. There's only a question about how much regulation has reversed the bend in the playing field that the individual players have put in here. This is going to be a Wild West. And I actually told NSF, I said, you know, like, maybe you ought to hand this over to a part of the government that is more used to dealing with things in an adversarial way. Oh no, Paul, we're building the internet, we're all friends, nothing bad will happen. Okay. You know, and it's the same thing here. The domain name industry is tens of billions of dollars, and a lot of it is very opaque. One of the things Bert did, which is a totally silly thing, but was just a wonderful PR thing, was he made a web extension that would go ding on your machine every time you sent data to Google. Now the problem, of course, is that it dings enough to just be annoying. I mean, just over and over and over again. But showing that tool off to some of the Dutch legislature evidently was very effective. You know, it's one thing to say Google knows everything. It's another thing to just be sitting there going ding, 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 ding. At any rate, I found it very funny. So I'm going to just finish up here and say the lessons that the lessons that I think are out there. The network is already balkanized, and this Balkan thing is just like a marketing term. Okay, I think what we ought to do, we might say the network has always been a mosaic and always will be. And there's always a question about whether or not you want to put the grout in between you and the next tile. I'm sorry, strange analogy. But it's always been divided, but the thing is that we've found ways to federate between parties, and we can federate either at a very basic level or at a higher level. I think that the way I look at it is that, for example, let's say Ethernet chips and so forth, that might be the very lowest level of cooperation, and they get smuggled between countries regardless of what sanctions are out there. And Cisco parts get smuggled around the world regardless of sanctions. And you know, U.S. sanctions that I talked about have been great for Turkey because they just like are in the middleman and sell to both sides and just have a lot of business. But at any rate, just trying to put it all back, Humpty Dumpty was never in one piece, and it's just not the right way to think about things. I think you ought to think about things as bottom-up, built by consensus, usually bilateral. DNS, DOE, etc. DNS filtering, I like to talk about things, my favorite things are things that work in practice, if not in theory. So I love the fact that there were a bunch of people who told me the DNS was theoretically impossible back in the 1980s. But filtering is something that works in practice, if not in theory. When I say that, it's because I know that we have a pipeline company that was one of our customers that was running the same software as Colonial Pipeline, and we continued running. We were just lucky that we could interrupt one part of the whole attack vector, or kill chain, as some people call it. You know, our guys called us in a panic and said, "Oh my God, we're running that stuff, and these people are on fire because they have this chunk of software, and we have it too, but we're not burning." And I said, "Well, yeah, but you better update it pretty quick, because you've just had that one layer that happened to have protected you." If DNS security is so important, why can't you tell applications that they must demand it? You know, the Internet Society has been pushing the publish signed data, although I guess Microsoft hasn't noticed. Oh well. You know, if you can't demand it, what's the point of having it? It's sort of like locks on every door, but nobody gets issued keys and the locks are never set, or something. DOE, I think, is really about centralizing the internet, and it does nothing to protect you from what I call the alpha privacy predators. The IETF has just recently published a RFC about how, you know, they're really behind the users. I have my doubts about that. You see, as far as I could tell, all the people that were there were being sent by vendors. You know, there are a lot of people at the IETF who try to be noble on them, but, you know, basically it's a trade organization. Birds, frogs. We need to try and stop and reverse a lot of these trends, or accept that we're already boiled. You know, right now I think we're boiled. You know, there's always this question. I think the two important questions about this are: is there anything we need to worry about which will be irreversible if it happens? You know, learning from your mistakes is great, except when, you know, your mistake destroys the world. That wouldn't be good. You know, are we faced with these trends that we can't reverse? And I think we should, you know, we need to reverse some of them, but how? So I don't know if I'm over or under time or whatever, but that's what I have to say today.
Thank you, Paul. I think we actually have plenty of time for question and answers. We want to stop, I think, at about 10 till, so we've got about 11 or so minutes. Questions from the audience here? There you go. That mic didn't seem to work very well. Let's see if this one will work better. Try this one.
Thanks, Paul. Really nice talk. So I totally agree on the, say, DNS privacy risks towards centralization. So I think, unfortunately, privacy is often used as a pretext to introduce like new centralized say architectures or protocols. And so DNS over HTTPS, I think it's only the first step. So what we are now seeing is what's called OHI, so the similar approach, basically relaying HTTP requests over a network of, say, non-colluding relays. And so, maybe a bit of anecdote, I have tried one of the products there, And so interestingly, it gave me worse web performance because suddenly I was exposed to all those trackers, advertisements, and so on that I previously didn't see because I had a application layer firewall on my machine. And so these systems, I think probably on purpose, bypass these things. And then, so my question is similar to what you mentioned regarding requesting DNSSEC. I think what we need is a rethinking of how we can give back users control of what their machines, their software are doing with the internet, not only with the DNS, but I think that's a very good point that you mentioned. Wonder if you have any further thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's one school of thought that says that the big guys like the Googles, Apple, and Microsoft of the world are trying to force you to send all of your traffic sort of through their infrastructure as a first hop. So I don't want to pick on any one of them, but for example, Apple has the service now which purportedly anonymizes your mail and web traffic and so forth, but it does mean that you send it all through them. Google has a service that I think they claim different benefits, but it's the same kind of idea. So, the internet was supposedly all about cutting out the middleman, but one of the things the internet has proven is that there's a bunch of middleman roles that are impressively profitable. One of the products that we sell is a web application firewall, or WAF, for if you have your infrastructure in Amazon. And what it does is it just says you have a set of rules and you can not violate sanctions, and you can sit there and sell CPUs and electronic parts and probably not violate sanctions if you just use the right set of filtering rules. The interesting thing about that is that we make that available through the Amazon marketplace. Amazon tries the hardest they can to never let us know who the customer is. They do charge the customer and they do pass some of the money through. But they try and keep that all as arm's length kind of thing, which is it's sort of interesting. The whole middleman. If you can figure out how to use the internet to make you a middleman and basically centralize things, there's huge profits to be made. So when I was when Dave was telling me about the distributed computer system way back when, distribution and Paul Barron and all of that was the holy grail. But from a business point of view, there's nothing really better than a monopoly, which is government saying you are the middleman. And if you can't do it, if the government won't do it, well, just being the middleman itself is incredibly profitable, and that's what you see shaping a lot of these technologies, I think.
Thanks, Dave. Question from Dan?
Okay. Thank you for pointing out Apple's hypocrisy on privacy. It really is something. My question is about whether you think the notion of federation from the bottom up, as in services like Mastodon and other Fediverse kinds of things, are going to be in any way better than the centralized social networks that we have today? And what are the security implications of those?
The thing I learned as I got into sort of the industrial part of the internet age was that things like data centers that centralized resources and so forth, have certain economies of scale, and you can have a limited number of hands and eyes that can service things when they fail. So that, what I think most of those companies do is they try and get the benefits of a distributed architecture for themselves, but use it to create a centralized service. So there's nothing wrong with distribution and having multiple data centers and et cetera, certainly has created great benefits for Amazon, Google, et cetera, et cetera. Getting it to the end user, I don't know. Is it possible for, it's sort of like a Star Wars movie. Is it possible for the people of the ice planet to get together with applications and compete against the Empire? It's kind of hard when the Empire, can say, oh, look, an interesting idea you've got here, Dan, but we'll throw $1 billion at it. I don't know. I wish I could say that applications rising from the bottom up. I mean, I don't know. I use Signal, and I think it has part of an aspect of that. There's other apps that I wish I could use. The problem I think with my phone is that loading a new app is like sharing a needle. You're never quite sure whether or not you've just done something really bad to yourself. So I think that I wish my phone was more like a virtual machine environment that tried to keep all of these apps completely separate. I understand the leverage of sharing contacts and so forth, but the security implications of plugging in all this kind of stuff is like the medical implications of sharing a hypodermic needle. I mean, it's easy for bad things to happen.
Other questions? Dave has one.
And one of the problems which you alluded to is that our technology and our systems have been evolved, and quite often they've evolved from a flaky start. So, it's, I think, understood that the computer processors that we have in all our machines are not secureable. It's a strong statement, but I think it's true. Operating systems are a nightmare. Nobody really understands completely what's going on in even the Windows or Mac OS. Not enough detail to protect it. And as somebody pointed out, and I think it's an interesting thing, as you put, I use the term AI into the software of our systems, you now maybe have an environment where you cannot, in any meaningful sense, certify that it's correct. Any comments on how we get out of this mess?
Well, I think there's mostly bad news, but I have a little bit of good news. At UC Irvine, after a while I said, we should have a connection to the internet. And so Marshall Rose, who you know, and we were going to go run a dial-up line to ISI and connect it. So I went around to people in UC Irvine and I said, okay, physics department, would you like to be connected to this internet thing? Go away, we don't care. Computer science department, would you like to be connected to it? No, we're more interested in Lisp. Okay, because they were at the time wrote a version of Lisp. I always wonder where Lisp went. And the only thing that happened was that eventually I happened to be hanging out with some people with this TLG project, it was the Thesaurus Lingua Greca, which was a project to collect all of the uses, little snippets of papyrus or whatever, with ancient Greek on them. And they wanted to put it all on what they call those big video discs, and distribute them so that there was a dictionary of ancient Greek, basically, or thesaurus. And so what they were doing is every day they would get like a snippet from somebody and they would send a letter back and so forth. And they said, we could send like email to these people now, right? And I said, yeah, sign us up. Now the problem with this was that I'd also talked to the social science people. The social ecology people said, well, Paul, this is a great idea. We'll let you know when you can go ahead because we want to study the evolution of the introduction of the network to UC Irvine. And so, of course, what happened was that the TLG people and myself said, that's really great, we agree, go write the plan, and we'll eagerly await that. We're going to debug the technology a little bit while we do that, of course, which was, well, you know, we have to test the system. So by the time they ever got back to us, of course, the test had been going for a year or something, and it was too late to measure the introduction because it had already happened. And I did it, and the same thing happens with CRISPR and, you know, technology and so forth. The technology people don't have a really good record about saying we're going to stop what we're going to do. I do think that there's encouragement in the U.S. government, because in the U.S., I think eventually you're going to have liability is the only way to get people to worry more about the reliability of their software. So that, I hate to say it, but I think that adding lawyers to this will be an encouraging step forward. But that's about it. I suspect that there's probably some CPUs you could secure, but not the one that's in this machine.
There's some, I mean, over the years, there have been proposals and actual instantiations of secure machines, but either they cost more or they performed not as well as the unprotected machines. And companies have basically said, we're not willing to spend the money. There's several examples of that. I wonder if we're not at a stage now where you can't afford not to spend the money.
Well, I don't know whether you're talking about Intel and its, what was it, 432 architecture and so
Way past that one, yeah.
Yeah, there's, I'll tell you a different story. Okay?
Yeah.
A bunch of people say I invented SMTP. It's not true. Okay, the only thing that I invented was the S part. Because one day I was given the job of writing code, and here's the spec, and the code is MTP. And I look at it, and I go, the first thing we have to do is butcher the spec. So we simplified it, and I just threw out half of it. And that made life a lot easier. So I did contribute the S in SMTP, but that's it. I think that from a standpoint of having an architecture that's more securable, you know, RISC-V is more likely to get you there than Intel. You know, RISC-V is sort of an open standard RISC architecture as opposed to a complex architecture. And I think the more complex, I think what you want is a simple virtualizable architecture. You know, billions of dollars of Apple phones out there kind of don't have that.
Devil is in the details of it.
All right, thank you. Let's thank Paul for the speech one more time.